Let us start. So we often talk about how Africa is leading the way in terms of its potential to be the tech continent of the future. And the reason we say this is not because there is any level of advanced technology beyond what exists in Korea, but talking about the sheer stats of population growth. There is an enormous population explosion on the continent, and not just a population explosion meaning lots of people, but meaning lots of young people. And it is the power of the youth demographic that Africa has that is driving this tech revolution. So huge growth means huge need. And right now, Africa is an unleveraged opportunity. If you have got population explosion that is not growing in a linear fashion, but is exponentially growing, which is the reality Africa has, that means that the way we produce food, the way we educate, the way we do transport, the way we deliver healthcare, the way we communicate with each other has to leapfrog. We cannot find solutions in a linear fashion. We have to find solutions that will meet us where the population growth is going. And that is where the call for innovators around the world to come to Africa and participate in this innovation revolution fundamentally stems from. An enormous amount of young people needing to be educated, wanting to work, and also who will become the workforce of the future. So as we see population collapse and decline in the other parts of the world, it is Africa who will be servicing that need of a workforce. So here are some basic stats that are always useful. We talk about how by the end of the century, some are saying maybe even before the end of the century, Africa will be the center of the world's urban future. I'm sure many of you with your organizations know that this notion of borderless, which we talk a lot about in the innovation space, is going to become increasingly borderless as geopolitically people are looking at city-based strategies. Well, from a city-based strategy, 13 of 20 of the world's largest cities will be in Africa. So if you're thinking about growing markets, that's what's happening here. Africa has some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and that's only set to increase. We also know that 1/3 of the world's population will be in Africa. And this is important to note because not just for markets, but for where the consumer need is from both a government service delivery point of view, a development delivery point of view, and then obviously a commercial point of view. We also know that the major interest in Africa is the natural resources. And what often affects the tech community is ag tech, is the agricultural landscape. So 60% of the world's arable land is in Africa. And that is a major factor in an era where we're looking at global supply chains and we're looking at food production. From a young point of view, by 2030, young Africans are expected to constitute 42% of global youth. So if any of you are young, even though we all consider ourselves young, if you're young or if you have children, you can know that their reality will involve working with young Africans. I read a stat very recently that said 1 in 4 people in the world will be Africans. And that's why I talk about this multicultural understanding, taking strategic and intentional time to get to know each other's cultures, because it is inevitable that should you want to be competitive in the future, you will need to have an Africa strategy and you will need to have Africa partners. So the major story around Africa is that we have this ability to leapfrog the rest of the world. In the absence of infrastructure, there is no need to go back and build to plug into old infrastructure. We can build from scratch. We can implement the best immediately. And that is what a lot of the African countries are doing. So we talk about how the world's increasingly relying on Africa for resources and innovation to unlock these resources, innovation to mobilize these youth and these workforces and the opportunity for job creation on the continent. And this is why Africa is fast becoming the go-to market for global innovators. This is where global innovators are choosing to launch and expand their solutions. Right. Very briefly, I'm going to touch on this rising movement of startup acts that we've seen across Africa. In every country, you will always have market indicators. And market indicators are not just the currency rate, it's not just around the GDP of a country, but they're often emerging market indicators that you can read to see where the country is moving. What we have seen across Africa is this Startup Act revolution. Now, a Startup Act is a movement where countries are reviewing their legislation and their policy and are making amendments that create enabling environments for high-tech, high-growth startups to flourish. To give you an example, this is a timeline to show how rapidly this has been happening. They are called startup movements because they affect multiple pieces of legislation, and that is specific to each country and their legislative approach. But what we see here is Ghana was one of the first to launch a Small Business Act. So at the bottom, you'll see SBA, and that stands for Small Business Act. Many of the Small Business Acts speak directly to startup communities and tend to be the ones that are primarily being amended. Then you will see Zambia and South Africa followed just after 1995, Morocco, Botswana, Gabon. So it started with a Small Business Act movement from the 1980s. Now what is happening is that we're seeing that the Small Business Act has to specifically address the needs of technology startups. So Italy was one of the first to look at this approach and say, well, how do we amend our legislation so that we create a policy enabling environment for our startups? This was then followed by Argentina and by Spain from an outside of Africa point of view. The first mover in Africa that made this adjustment was Tunisia. So in 2016, Tunisia was one of the first African countries to review its legislation and to start learning from Italy and implementing their legislative changes. Shortly after, Senegal joined, and then you can see very recently we've had the DRC and Nigeria. Now, South Africa is not listed on here, but South Africa was also one of the first movers here, but has not yet been able to enact the legislative changes because they relate predominantly to foreign exchange controls, which sit with the Treasury, which is a much longer process to make that national amendment. Now, the reason that I have shared this with you is for you as somebody either operating in Africa or someone seeking to operate in Africa to understand that the minute legislation becomes enabling, then you must know that there's going to be rapid implementation. And that is what we are trying to do, prepare for collectively here, is how do we establish these cooperative global relationships now to be able to ride the wave of this rapid movement we'll be seeing. Right, that is from my side. I've worked in the Center of the African Innovation System for just over a decade across various ecosystem projects. At my core, I have worked to build Pan-African projects that are for the benefit of a globalized Africa. And most recently, we've spent the last few years building the Global Startup Awards Africa and working alongside Philip Baldwin with the Gig Africa Fund.